Welcome to Echoes of the Midnight, a channel where every whisper hides a haunting truth. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let the midnight tales pull you into their chilling embrace. The question is, can you make it to the end?
In the frosty December of 2024, the seaside town of Tynemouth lay cloaked in wintry stillness. The cobblestone streets, draped in thick snow, echoed with the crunch of hurried footsteps and the faint hum of carolers. It was the kind of place where traditions lingered like the scent of pine in the air. But belief in old legends had long since faded. The townsfolk, their lives lit by phone screens and modern comforts, dismissed the ancient tales of Gryla and her brood as relics of a bygone age. Just stories to frighten children, the shopkeepers would say with a chuckle, their windows glowing with festive displays. Yet, as the days grew darker and the sea wind howled through narrow alleys, unease crept into the town. Whispers of strange footprints in the snow and guttural laughter in the night spread, but they were met with scoffs. When the first disappearance occurred, a child's empty sled abandoned by the pier, many shrugged it off as a tragic accident. But the shadows were stirring, and ignorance would soon become regret. It started innocuously enough. The first snowfall of December came early, blanketing Tynemouth in a shimmering frost that seemed magical at first. Thick, powdery flakes drifted down in relentless waves, muting the world in an eerie, oppressive silence. The usual hum of life dulled, as if the snow itself had stolen sound from the air. Even the sea, which typically roared against the rocky cliffs, seemed subdued. At first, people chalked it up to the weather, a freak storm, or a quirk of nature. But nature didn't explain everything. Power outages soon began to ripple through the town, plunging entire streets into darkness. The cheerful twinkle of Christmas lights disappeared, replaced by flickering candles in frosty windows. Conversations in homes grew quieter, laced with an unease no one wanted to name. And the children, those who normally delighted in building snowmen and pelting each other with snowballs, seemed subdued, their laughter replaced by whispered secrets. Katie Cooper noticed the change immediately. At 21, she was an unapologetic skeptic. A college student studying psychology, she prided herself on logical thinking, dismissing her small town's fascination with folklore and old wives' tales as superstitions clinging to the past. Coming home for the holidays was a chore, filled with too many forced smiles and awkward dinners with extended family she barely knew. But this year, the town felt different. Off. Her younger brother Sam was the first to speak of it. Just 9 years old, Sam was at that in-between stage. Old enough to know Santa wasn't real, but still young enough to want to believe in magic. "I keep hearing noises in the attic," he whispered one night after dinner, his wide brown eyes darting to the ceiling. "Scratching. And laughing." Katie laughed it off, tousling his hair. "It's just squirrels, Sam. You're letting your imagination run wild." Their father, a gruff man with a no-nonsense attitude, chimed in. "Exactly. The cold probably drove them in. I'll set some traps tomorrow." But Katie wasn't convinced. She'd lived in this house long enough to know there were no easy ways into the attic, no holes or gaps for animals to squeeze through. And the noises Sam described, scraping, dragging, and a low, guttural chuckle, didn't sound like squirrels. Still, she didn't press the issue. Sam had always been the imaginative one, spinning stories about monsters under his bed or ghosts in the basement. It was probably just a phase. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. Katie lay in bed scrolling through her phone, the dim light casting shadows on her bedroom walls. She tried to lose herself in videos and memes, but her mind kept drifting back to Sam's words. Laughing, he'd said. The idea unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Around midnight, the house grew unnaturally quiet. Katie had lived through plenty of winter storms, but this was different. The silence was absolute, heavy, and unnerving. She couldn't hear the wind, the creak of the old pipes, or even the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then she heard it. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, echoed from above. Katie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained her ears, hoping she'd imagined it. But the noise came again, slow, deliberate, and followed by a soft, almost playful chuckle. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive silence, it might as well have been a scream. Katie's logical mind wrestled with her instincts. It had to be an animal, she told herself. Maybe their father was right and a squirrel or a raccoon had somehow found its way in. But deep down, a part of her, the part that had grown up hearing the town stories of Gryla and her monstrous brood, felt a prickle of fear. Gathering her courage, she slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight she kept on her nightstand. The beam cut through the darkness as she crept into the hallway. The house felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that settled deep into your bones. Her bare feet pressed against the icy floorboards as she made her way to Sam's room. He was sitting upright in bed, clutching his blanket. "You heard it, didn't you?" he whispered. He turned pale and pinched his eyebrows. Katie hesitated before nodding. "Probably just the wind," she lied. "Go back to sleep. Exercise fixes things." The workout had the effect she wanted, downregulating her nervous system. But Sam shook his head. "It's not the wind. It's..." "Dem?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones from the stories," Sam said, his voice trembling. "The Yule Lads." Katie's stomach tightened. She wanted to dismiss him, to tell him he was being ridiculous, but something about the fear in his eyes, the way his voice quavered, made her pause. She didn't believe in fairy tales, but the noises, horses, and the laugh were undeniably real. For the rest of the night, Katie stayed awake, sitting by Sam's bed with the flashlight in her hand. The scraping sound stopped, but the oppressive silence lingered, wrapping around the house like a shroud. By morning, Katie was certain of one thing: something was wrong. And whatever it wasn't just squirrels. The morning of December 13th was eerily still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears like cotton. The sun struggled to pierce through the gray clouds, and the town of Tynemouth woke to a chilling discovery. 6-year-old Ethan Carter was missing. His mother, a soft-spoken woman who rarely drew attention, had called the police in a panic after finding his bed empty. The details of the case quickly spread through the close-knit community. Ethan's shoes were still neatly by the door, his favorite red mittens tucked into their usual spot on the radiator. It was as if he'd vanished without ever preparing to leave. But the most unsettling clue was the trail of muddy footprints leading from his bedroom to the fireplace. Small, child-sized footprints, mixed with larger ones that didn't belong to anyone in the house. The prints stopped abruptly at the hearth, as though the boy had been swallowed whole by the chimney. The police were baffled. They scoured the house, the yard, and the woods beyond, but there were no tracks in the freshly fallen snow. "He must have wandered out during the storm," the lead investigator suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The implication was enough to unnerve the entire town. If a child could vanish into thin air, what else could be lurking out there? That night, the atmosphere in the Cooper household was strained. Katie tried to distract Sam with Christmas movies, but he was jumpy, his eyes darting to the windows every time the wind howled. Their parents were quiet, pretending everything was normal, but Katie could see the tension in their clenched jaws and the way they kept glancing at their phones. Katie wasn't ready to admit it, but Ethan's disappearance gnawed at her. The muddy footprints, the silent storm, the lack of any trail. It didn't make sense. She'd always been a skeptic, but even her logical mind struggled to find a rational explanation. Around midnight, just as the house had settled into uneasy silence, Katie was jolted awake by the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. Sam stood in the doorway clutching his blanket, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "Katie," he whispered, his voice trembling, "there's a man outside my window." She sat up instantly, her heart hammering. "What do you mean, a man? Are you sure?" Sam nodded vigorously. "He was standing there, staring at me. He had a really long nose, and he was sniffing, like a dog." Katie's stomach tightened. She grabbed her phone and a flashlight from her nightstand, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Okay, let's check it out. It's probably nothing." Sam clung to her side as they crept down the hall to his room. The air was colder than usual, and Katie could see her breath in the dim light of the hallway. When they reached his room, she hesitated for a moment before pulling back the curtain. The world outside was still and dark. Snow glittered faintly under the pale glow of a street lamp. At first, Katie saw nothing, but then, just beyond the edge of the yard, a shadow moved, tall and spindly, retreating into the blackness of the forest. Her breath caught. "Probably a deer," she muttered, though her voice wavered. She dropped the curtain quickly, her hands trembling. Sam shook his head, clutching her arm. It wasn't a deer. It was a man, and he had a sack, like he was carrying something. Katie crouched to look him in the eye. "Listen, it's late, and your mind is probably playing tricks on you. Just stay in my room tonight, okay?" Sam reluctantly agreed, but as Katie settled him into her bed, she couldn't shake the image of the shadow retreating into the trees. It hadn't moved like a deer. There had been a deliberate slowness to its steps, as though it wanted to be seen before it disappeared. The next morning, Katie stood at the edge of the woods, staring into the dense line of trees. A faint trail of disturbed snow led into the forest, but it stopped abruptly, vanishing as though whoever or whatever had made it had simply lifted off the ground. Sam's words echoed in her mind. He had a long nose, and he was sniffing like a dog. Katie had dismissed her brother's fears before, but now she wasn't so sure. Something was out there, and it wasn't done. "It's freeing," she said. By December 20th, Tynemouth was unraveling. The snowfall, once picturesque, now felt like a suffocating blanket that smothered the town in silence. The disappearances continued. Each morning brought fresh heartbreak as another empty bed was discovered. Parents huddled in hushed groups, exchanging frantic theories, but no answers came. The police were overwhelmed, offering vague reassurances that only deepened the fear. and then there were the sightings. People began whispering about figures seen moving in the night. A lanky man with unnaturally long arms, dragging a sack behind him, was spotted in a neighbor's backyard. Another figure, grotesquely bloated, waddled through the snow, his shadow casting strange shapes against the walls. Most unsettling of all was the one with the crooked grin, who pressed his face to frosted windows, peering into homes with unblinking eyes. The sightings were dismissed by some as hysteria, but Katie wasn't so sure. Ever since that night with Sam, she'd felt a growing dread, a sense that something ancient and malevolent had seeped into their town. Katie threw herself into research. She spent hours scrolling through online forums and archived news reports, hunting for any explanation that might fit the strange events. Most of what she found was mundane: accounts of wild animals, bizarre weather phenomena, or urban legends. But one thread caught her attention: a discussion about Icelandic folklore. The name Gryla jumped out at her. Gryla, the Christmas witch, a monstrous giantess said to roam the mountains of Iceland during Christmas time, searching for naughty children to snatch away. The more Katie read, the colder she felt. Gryla wasn't alone. She was accompanied by her 13 sons, known as the Yule Lads, each one as twisted as the next. History: window peeper, door sniffer, meat hook, candle stealer. The list went on, each name conjuring a vivid, nightmarish image. The Yule Lads weren't just mischievous pranksters, they were predators, and their arrival, the legend said, heralded Gryla's hunt. Katie leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. It was absurd, she knew that. Legends like these were created to scare children into behaving during the holidays. But the parallels were too close to ignore. Figures with grotesque features moving in the night, the children disappearing without a trace. Even the footprints by Ethan's fireplace seemed to align with the stories. When she shared her findings with her mother, she was met with a dismissive laugh. "Katie, it's just folklore, stories to entertain people long ago. We've got real problems here, not fairy tales." But Katie couldn't shake the gnawing unease that grew with each passing day. The town's descent into fear felt too deliberate, too targeted. "What if it isn't just folklore?" she muttered to herself, staring at the screen. The words seemed absurd even as they left her lips. That night, Katie barely slept. She lay in bed, her laptop beside her. The images of Gryla and the Yule Lads burned into her mind. Every creak of the old house made her flinch. At one point, she thought she heard a faint tapping at her window, but when she worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of white snow glowing faintly under the moonlight. When morning came, the town felt even more subdued. Rumors swirled of another disappearance, this time a pair of siblings. Their beds found empty, their window left ajar. Their father claimed he'd heard something in the night, a scraping sound followed by what he swore was laughter. But no one believed him. Katie knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Whether or not Gryla and her sons were real, something was preying on Tynemouth, and it was growing bolder. On Christmas Eve, the Cooper household was plunged into a nightmare. Katie awoke in the middle of the night to an eerie sound, scraping deep within the walls, as though something alive was clawing its way through the old wood. She sat up, her heart pounding, and immediately noticed the silence. The storm that had raged all evening had quieted, leaving a deafening stillness in its wake. She swung her legs out of bed, the icy floorboards making her shiver, and instinctively glanced at Sam's bed. It was empty. The neatly folded blanket and pillow looked untouched, as though he'd been plucked from it without a struggle. Panic set in as she searched the room, calling his name in a whisper that grew louder and more desperate. There was no answer. Downstairs, she found the front door slightly ajar, snow swirling in through the gap. The tracks were back, muddy footprints leading from the hallway and out into the storm. Unlike the ones found at Ethan's house, these didn't lead to the fireplace, but instead veered toward the forest at the edge of town. Katie stared at them, dread pooling in her stomach. Sam had always been terrified of the dark woods. There was no way he'd have gone there willingly. Grabbing a flashlight and her phone, Katie threw on her coat and boots, not bothering to wake her parents. They wouldn't believe her, not until it was too late. She stepped into the freezing night, the snow crunching loudly underfoot. Her breath formed ghostly clouds in the air as she followed the trail, her flashlight beam bouncing off the glistening snow. The footprints were uneven, almost dragging, as though whoever or whatever had taken Sam wasn't entirely human. The wind howled around her, carrying faint sounds that made her blood run cold. Laughter, high-pitched and inhuman, echoed through the trees. Then came a voice, low and guttural, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. Katie's grip on the flashlight tightened as she pressed on, her fear overridden by desperation. The trail led deeper into the woods, where the snow grew thicker and the trees loomed like towering shadows. That's when she saw it. A hut, ancient and crooked, barely visible beneath layers of frost and snow. Its walls were made of dark, weathered wood, and smoke curled lazily from a misshapen chimney. Every instinct screamed at Katie to turn back, but she couldn't leave Sam behind. As she approached, the stench hit her. A foul mix of rotting meat and something metallic, like blood. Katie gagged, pulling her scarf over her nose, but it did little to block the putrid smell. The closer she got, the louder the sounds became. The bubbling of a cauldron, faint sobs, and the unmistakable cries of children. She crept to the window, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure whatever was inside would hear her. Peering through the frosted glass, she felt her stomach lurch. Inside was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The dim room was lit by a fire roaring beneath a massive blackened cauldron. Suspended above it was a cage, and inside were 3 children, their faces pale and streaked with tears. They clung to each other, trembling. Near the cauldron stood a figure that made Katie's blood freeze. Gryla. She was enormous, her hunched frame draped in tattered fur-lined robes. Her face was leathery and twisted, with sharp yellowed teeth that jutted out from her wide, cruel mouth. Her eyes, dark and sunken, seemed to glow faintly as she stirred the cauldron, muttering to herself in the same guttural language Katie had heard in the wind. Around her scurried smaller figures, the Yule Lads. Katie recognized them immediately from the descriptions she'd read. One had an unnaturally long nose, sniffing at the air as though hunting prey. Another was grotesquely bloated, gnawing on what looked horrifyingly like a bone. A third darted to the window, its crooked grin revealing rows of jagged teeth. Katie ducked just in time, her back pressed against the icy wall of the hut. She was shaking now, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What could she do? Charging in seemed suicidal, but leaving Sam wasn't an option. As she stood there, trying to steady her nerves, she heard a voice. Sam's voice. crying out weakly from inside the hut. "Help me," he whimpered. Katie knew she didn't have much time. Taking one last deep breath, she tightened her grip on the flashlight, determined to face whatever horrors waited inside. Katie didn't stop to think as she burst through the rotting wooden door, the force of her entrance sending a shower of snow tumbling from the roof. The stench of decay hit her like a wall, making her gag. But she pressed on. The scene inside was worse than anything she could have imagined. Gryla stood at the center of the room, a hulking figure cloaked in layers of filthy, fur-lined robes. Her face was monstrous. Leathery skin stretched tight over jagged bones, her mouth twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of yellowed, cracked teeth. Her eyes were black pits, glinting with malice as she stirred a massive, bubbling cauldron. The thick, dark liquid inside roiled and hissed, sending up plumes of foul-smelling steam. Around her scurried the Yule Lads, grotesque in their own right. One had a long, twitching nose that sniffed the air hungrily. Another was grotesquely bloated, his hands clutching half-gnawed bones. A third crouched by the fire, his crooked grin making Katie's skin crawl as he sharpened a jagged hook. Each of them moved with a twisted energy, their forms almost shadow-like, shifting and flickering as they danced around their mother. Katie's heart sank when she saw Sam. He was huddled with 3 other children in a rusted iron cage suspended above the floor, their faces pale and streaked with tears. Sam's eyes locked with hers, and he reached out through the bars, his voice barely audible over the bubbling cauldron. "Katie, help me!" Gryla's head snapped up, her nostrils flaring. "Another one," she hissed, her voice like the crunch of bone underfoot. "So brave, so foolish." Katie's hands trembled as she grabbed a poker from the hearth. The heat seared her palm, but she didn't care. She swung the weapon at Gryla with all her strength, but it was like striking stone. Gryla barely flinched, her black eyes glinting with amusement. The Yule Lads turned toward Katie, their grotesque faces alight with glee. They began to close in, their movements predatory and deliberate. Desperation clawed at Katie's mind, but then a memory flickered. Something she had read in her frantic research. Gryla and her sons were bound by the rules of their ancient traditions. If she could challenge those rules, she might have a chance. "I challenge you to a riddle," Katie shouted, her voice cracking but filled with determination. Gryla froze, her massive frame turning toward Katie. The Yule Lads stopped in their tracks, their grotesque forms flickering with confusion. "A riddle?" Gryla growled, her voice low and menacing. "Yes," Katie said, forcing herself to stand tall. "Answer it and you can take me. Fail and you leave us alone." The room fell silent, the only sound the bubbling of the cauldron and the faint whimpers of the children. Gryla's lips curled into a sneer. "Speak, little morsel. What is your riddle?" Katie's breath came in shallow gasps, but she forced the words out. "What has no beginning, no end, and consumes all in its path." Gryla's black eyes narrowed. The Yule Lads shifted restlessly, their grotesque forms twitching as they exchanged uneasy glances. The giantess began to pace, her massive claws clicking against the floor as she pondered. "No beginning, no end," she muttered, her voice dripping with frustration. Katie's grip on the poker tightened as Gryla suddenly stopped, her gaze locking onto Katie. "Time!" she bellowed, her voice shaking the walls of the hut. Katie allowed herself the faintest smirk. "Wrong," she said, her voice steady now. "The answer is hunger. Your insatiable hunger." The room seemed to shudder as Katie's words hung in the air. Gryla's expression twisted into one of pure rage. "No!" she shrieked, her voice a deafening wail. The Yule Lads screamed in unison, their grotesque forms unraveling into wisps of shadow. The hut trembled as Gryla's massive frame began to dissolve, her claws grasping at the air as she let out one final, ear-splitting scream. In seconds, the room was empty, save for the cage of trembling children and the faint, eerie glow of the cauldron. Katie ran to the cage, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch. "It's okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the children. "It's over. You're safe now." But as the snow outside swirled through the cracks in the walls, Katie couldn't help but feel that Gryla's shadow hadn't disappeared entirely. Katie stumbled into town at dawn, the children clinging to her, their small hands trembling in hers. The storm that had raged for days was finally easing, the wind quieting to a soft whisper. Snowflakes still fell, but now they seemed gentle, a blanket of calm after the terror that had gripped Tynemouth. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the gray sky, Katie felt a fragile hope return to the world. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. Mothers and fathers rushed to embrace the missing children, their sobs of relief echoing through the still morning. When Katie tried to explain what had happened, her words were met with disbelief and murmurs of skepticism. "Gryla?" someone whispered. "The Yule Lads, it's just a story." I sprang to my feet. "What do we know?" But the children's terrified faces told a different tale. They spoke of the monstrous woman with black, soulless eyes, and the shadowy figures that had dragged them into the woods. Some listened, their expressions grim, while others turned away, unwilling to believe such darkness could touch their quiet town. Katie didn't argue. She had no energy to convince them. What mattered was that the children were safe. For now. In the days that followed, Tynemouth began to heal, but it was a cautious recovery. The disappearances stopped, yet the air still carried a subtle weight, as if the shadows of Gryla and her brood lingered just beyond the edge of the forest. People whispered about Katie's bravery, about how she had faced the monster and lived to tell the tale, and though many dismissed her story as fantasy, a growing number of families began leaving small offerings by their fireplaces, plates of food, bowls of milk, just in case. For Katie, the experience left a mark deeper than words could express. She spent hours staring out her bedroom window, watching the snow fall and listening to the creaks and groans of the old house. Every sound made her heart race. Every shadow seemed alive with the possibility of something sinister. She knew Gryla wasn't truly gone. The legend had only been banished, not destroyed. One evening, as she sat with Sam by the fire, he looked up at her with wide, solemn eyes. "Do you think she'll come back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Katie hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Maybe," she said softly. "But if she does, we'll be ready." Sam nodded, his small hand slipping into hers. Together, they stared into the flames, their flickering light a fragile shield against the encroaching dark. In time, Katie's story became a part of Tynemouth's lore. Children grew up hearing about the brave young woman who faced Gryla and the Yule Lads, about the riddle that saved the town. Some dismissed it as a fable, while others carried the tale in their hearts, a warning passed down through generations. And though the years softened the terror of that Christmas, Katie never forgot. She never took the quiet of the snow for granted again. To her, it wasn't peace. It was the sound of something waiting, biding its time in the frozen wilderness. Somewhere out there, Gryla's hunger still simmered, patient and unrelenting. Katie knew that one day the shadows might stir again, but if that day came, the town of Tynemouth would remember. And so would she.
Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more. See you next time.